January 18th, 1945, a Wehrmacht Ordnance testing facility outside Berlin. Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer stood in the frozen pre-dawn darkness, watching his technical team prepare for what he expected to be a routine examination. Before him lay 3 American 5-inch artillery shells, their noses marked with peculiar fuses recovered from a captured ammunition depot during the Battle of the Bulge the previous month. Fischer had spent 7 years as a military engineer, 4 of those years analyzing captured Allied equipment. He had examined British radar components, dissected American tank transmissions, and tested Soviet artillery pieces. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The first shell sat clamped in a horizontal test fixture, its fuse assembly exposed for examination. Fischer's assistant, Hauptmann Werner Braun, a civilian engineer conscripted from Siemens, carefully connected oscilloscope probes to the fuse's external contacts. They intended to determine whether this was simply an improved time fuse or something more sophisticated. Braun activated the test equipment. The oscilloscope screen flickered to life, displaying a waveform that made no sense: radio frequency emissions. From inside an artillery shell fuse, at frequencies suggesting an active transmitter operating at approximately 200 MHz, Fischer felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the January temperature. He walked to the shell, examining the fuse nose more carefully. The casing appeared conventional, machined steel with a threaded base for mounting into the shell body, but the nose section contained something that defied every technical conclusion. German ordnance research had reached over a decade of investigation. Through a small inspection port, Fischer could see miniature glass vacuum tubes. Not ruggedized radio tubes designed for mobile equipment, but actual transmitter tubes, each no larger than a wine cork, embedded in what appeared to be shock-absorbing material. These delicate components were installed in a device designed to be fired from a gun at accelerations exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. "Test fire protocol," Fischer ordered quietly. His team looked at him with concern. Testing captured ammunition carried obvious risks, but Fischer needed to understand what the Americans had built. Within 30 minutes, they had transported one of the captured shells to an outdoor test range, loading it into a captured American artillery piece positioned to fire over an instrumented observation area. They mounted receiving antennas at various distances from the anticipated trajectory, connected to recording equipment that would capture any radio emissions. If the fuse was indeed transmitting during flight, they would detect it. If it was something else, they would at least gather data about its function. The gun fired. The shell arced across the frozen landscape. At a height of approximately 30 feet above the snow-covered ground, with no visible target within hundreds of meters, the shell exploded in a perfect airburst, detonating with surgical precision at an altitude optimized for anti-personnel effect. The recording equipment had captured everything. A continuous radio transmission from the moment the shell left the barrel until detonation. Doppler shift in the return signal as the shell approached the ground, and an electronic trigger that closed precisely when the reflected signal indicated optimal detonation range. Fischer stood motionless, watching smoke dissipate over the test range. The Americans had not simply improved time fuses. They had created a self-contained radar system that fit inside an artillery shell, survived forces that should pulverize delicate electronics, and functioned autonomously to detect targets and optimize detonation timing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The technical impossibility of what Fischer had just witnessed would force a fundamental reassessment of German understanding of American industrial and scientific capabilities. The story of how German engineers came to confront this technology, and what that confrontation revealed about the true nature of the war they were losing, began not with battlefield capture but with a decade of German research that had concluded such a device could not be built. September 1934, Kummersdorf Weapons Testing Facility, south of Berlin. German military research into proximity fuses had begun earlier than any other nation's efforts, driven by recognition that conventional anti-aircraft fire was becoming obsolete as aircraft performance improved. The Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Agency, had commissioned Rheinmetall Borsig to investigate potential solutions to what military planners termed the aircraft problem. Aircraft were evolving faster than gun systems. In 1918, fighters flew at 90 miles per hour at altitudes below 15,000 feet. By 1934, modern aircraft exceeded 300 miles per hour at altitudes above 30,000 feet. Traditional anti-aircraft guns required optical range-finding, manual height calculation, and timed fuses set by hand to explode at predetermined altitudes. The mathematics were unforgiving. Against a target traveling at 300 miles per hour, gunners had perhaps 20 to 30 seconds from detection to firing. In that time, they needed to calculate exact distance, predict future position, accounting for target speed and direction, set fuse timing, load ammunition, and fire. German fire control computers could perform these calculations, but accuracy remained abysmal. Pre-war estimates suggested that downing a single aircraft under combat conditions required between 10,000 and 20,000 rounds fired. The Luftwaffe, preparing for the next European war, needed better solutions. Rheinmetall engineers explored multiple approaches: acoustic fuses that would trigger on engine noise, photoelectric fuses that would respond to changes in light levels as a shell passed near an aircraft, electrostatic fuses that would detect the electrical charge on aircraft surfaces, and most ambitiously, radio-based fuses that would use reflected radio waves to detect proximity to targets. By 1937, Rheinmetall had developed over 30 different prototype designs. Extensive testing at Kummersdorf revealed fundamental problems with every approach. Acoustic fuses triggered on the wrong sounds, detonating prematurely or failing to detect actual targets. Photoelectric fuses were unreliable in cloudy conditions or at night. Electrostatic detection worked in laboratory conditions but failed when subjected to the electromagnetic interference of actual combat. Radio-based proximity detection showed the most promise theoretically, but the technical challenges appeared insurmountable. A functional radio proximity fuse required miniature vacuum tubes capable of surviving artillery acceleration. The smallest tubes available in 1937 were designed for hearing aids and weighed several grams. At 20,000 times gravity, those tubes would experience forces equivalent to several tons, crushing them for the fraction of a second. It took a shell to accelerate down a gun barrel. German engineers calculated that vacuum tube glass would shatter, internal filaments would break, and electrode structures would deform beyond function. Rheinmetall concluded that radio proximity fuses might work in rockets or bombs, which experienced far gentler acceleration, but could never function in artillery shells. A comprehensive 1939 report to the Heereswaffenamt detailed the research findings. The report acknowledged that proximity fuses offered enormous tactical advantages, potentially increasing anti-aircraft effectiveness by an order of magnitude. But the technical requirements exceeded available technology. The report recommended continuing research into acoustic and photoelectric approaches, while monitoring developments in miniaturized electronics. The outbreak of war in September 1939 temporarily ended German proximity fuse research. Military priorities shifted to weapons that could reach production quickly. Hitler's strategic guidance emphasized technologies deliverable within 6 months to support the coming campaigns in the West and the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Proximity fuses, classified as long-term research with uncertain outcomes, were among hundreds of projects cancelled or reduced to minimal funding. A handful of engineers at Rheinmetall continued limited investigation, but without priority, resources, or expectation of near-term results. German intelligence monitored Allied weapons development carefully throughout the war. Signals intelligence intercepted American military communications mentioning something called VT fuses, variable time fuses, assumed to be an improved mechanical timer. Luftwaffe pilots reported that American anti-aircraft fire had become more accurate in 1943, but attributed this to better radar fire control rather than any fundamental change in ammunition. The actual nature of American proximity fuses remained hidden, protected by security measures second only to the Manhattan Project. Every proximity-fused shell was numbered and tracked. Use over land was strictly prohibited until December 1944 to prevent capture of intact specimens. When American ships fired proximity fuses in combat, they did so over water where dud shells would sink beyond enemy recovery. This security held throughout 1943 and most of 1944. German intelligence collected fragmentary information, suggesting American anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased dramatically. But without physical evidence, analysts concluded the Americans had simply produced more guns and improved radar integration. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest Offensive, Germany's last major attack in the West, changed everything. German forces advancing through Belgium and Luxembourg overran several American supply dumps in the initial surprise assault. Among the captured material were thousands of rounds of American artillery ammunition, including several hundred 5-inch shells with unusual fuses marked with the designation MT. German ordnance officers examining the captured ammunition noticed the fuses immediately. They were larger than standard American time fuses and weighed noticeably more. The nose section appeared to be sealed, without the mechanical timer window visible on conventional fuses. Most curiously, the fuses were marked with handling warnings in English, cautioning against electrical interference and advising storage away from radar equipment. Ammunition recovered from the battlefield typically went to field depots for immediate reuse against the enemy. But several German officers recognized that these fuses might represent new technology worth analyzing. A small quantity, perhaps 20 rounds, were segregated and transported to ordnance testing facilities in Germany for examination. The first German engineers to disassemble an American proximity fuse in late December 1944 faced immediate cognitive dissonance. Inside the steel casing, they found electronics, not simple electrical components, but sophisticated radio circuitry featuring miniaturized vacuum tubes, precision capacitors, and what appeared to be a complete transmitter and receiver system. The vacuum tubes were unlike anything in German production. Each tube measured less than 1 inch in height, with glass envelopes barely thicker than paper but somehow reinforced to survive brutal acceleration. The internal elements were embedded in wax that had clearly been liquefied by heat during firing and had re-solidified afterward. Werner Braun, the Siemens engineer assigned to the initial analysis, later wrote in his technical report that his first assumption was that the fuse was designed for rockets or bombs. The electronics were too delicate for artillery, he reasoned. The fuse must have been removed from a bomb or missile and incorrectly installed in an artillery shell, perhaps by inexperienced American ordnance personnel. This assumption lasted until Braun examined multiple fuses and found identical construction in every specimen. The fuses were clearly production items, manufactured in quantity to consistent specifications. The Americans were deliberately installing sophisticated radio electronics into artillery shells. Braun's next assumption was that the electronics must not be functional, that they had been destroyed during firing. Perhaps the fuses were experimental prototypes that had failed testing, but detailed examination revealed no obvious damage. The vacuum tubes appeared intact. The wax potting showed no cracks. The battery reservoir contained electrolyte that had clearly been activated by centrifugal force. The fuses had been fired, and the electronics had survived. The technical analysis that followed over January 1945 revealed the sophistication of American engineering in methodical detail. The fuses contained complete radio transceivers operating at frequencies around 200 MHz. The transmitter used a simple oscillator circuit powered by a battery that activated only when the shell was spinning. The receiver amplified reflected radio signals and compared them to the transmitted frequency. A Doppler detection circuit measured frequency shift in the reflected signal. When the frequency shift indicated the shell was within lethal range of a target, an electronic switch closed, sending current to a detonator that exploded the main charge. The entire system operated autonomously. No external control was required. The fuse was self-contained, drawing power from its internal battery, transmitting continuously, processing return signals, and determining optimal detonation timing without any input from gunners or fire control systems. From an engineering standpoint, the achievement was extraordinary. From a military standpoint, the implications were catastrophic. If America could manufacture electronics that survived 20,000 times gravity, install them in artillery shells, and produce such shells in quantities sufficient for battlefield use, then German assumptions about American industrial capacity were fundamentally incorrect. Oberleutnant Fischer's test firing on January 18th provided unambiguous confirmation. The fuse worked exactly as designed, the shell transmitted during flight, the electronics survived firing, the detonation occurred, at precisely the optimal altitude for anti-personnel effect. Fischer wrote a detailed report to the Heereswaffenamt outlining his findings. The Americans had solved the proximity fuse problem that German engineers had concluded was unsolvable. More significantly, they had done so using an approach, radio frequency detection, that required the most sophisticated manufacturing and the highest component reliability. The report emphasized that this was not a crude battlefield expedient or a prototype system in limited testing. The fuses showed evidence of mass production. Multiple units examined were functionally identical, indicating standardized manufacturing processes. The quality of construction was uniformly high. These were production weapons manufactured in quantity and issued to field units as standard ammunition. Fischer's report included calculations about production requirements. Each fuse contained approximately 130 individual components. Manufacturing, shells in quantities sufficient for battlefield use, tens of thousands of rounds, meant producing millions of precision miniaturized parts, assembling them into reliable units, and maintaining quality control throughout. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German electronics industry, even at full capacity, could not have produced proximity fuses at scale. Vacuum tube manufacturing was already prioritized for radar, radio communications, and other critical systems. Diverting capacity to produce miniaturized tubes hardened for artillery use would have required shutting down other production lines. More fundamentally, German industry lacked the infrastructure for mass production of complex electronics. American approaches to manufacturing, emphasizing interchangeable parts, statistical quality control, and automated assembly, were more advanced than German methods that relied on skilled craftsmen and manual adjustment. Fischer concluded his report with an observation that transcended technical analysis. The proximity fuse revealed the true scale of the industrial and scientific gap between Germany and America. German engineers were not less skilled. German scientists understood the theoretical principles as well as their American counterparts, but German industry could not support the massive infrastructure required to turn theoretical knowledge into millions of reliable weapons. The report reached senior Wehrmacht leadership in late January 1945. By then, the Battle of the Bulge had failed. German forces were retreating toward the Rhine, subjected to devastating American artillery fire that featured continuous airburst effects. Soldiers returning from the front described the horror of facing shells that exploded overhead with perfect consistency, turning every position into a killing zone. German tactical doctrine had evolved over years of warfare based on certain assumptions. Artillery created crater patterns that soldiers could shelter in between impacts. Foxholes provided protection. Log-covered dugouts could withstand near misses. These assumptions had held through years of fighting on the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery was massive in quantity but conventional in effect. American proximity fuses invalidated every defensive technique German infantry had developed. Shells that detonated 30 feet above ground directed their fragments downward in a cone-shaped pattern that covered areas 50 times larger than ground bursts. Foxholes offered no protection from shrapnel falling from above. Dugouts became death traps as fragments penetrated through log roofs. German soldiers in defensive positions faced an impossible choice: Remaining in fortifications meant certain death when American artillery opened fire. Moving in the open during bombardment was equally suicidal. Some units attempted to disperse widely, spreading out to minimize casualties from individual shells. But dispersion reduced unit cohesion and made coordinated defense impossible. Oberst Heinrich Schwarz, commanding a Volksgrenadier division defending along the Rhine in February 1945, described the effect in his after-action report. His units had endured Soviet artillery barrages on the Eastern Front that delivered greater total explosive tonnage. But Soviet shells were time-fused or impact-detonated, creating predictable effects that soldiers could shelter against. American proximity-fused fire was categorically different. Every shell became an optimized airburst. Artillery observers could call fire on suspected positions without visual confirmation, knowing the shells would automatically detonate at lethal altitude. Areas that should have provided cover, reverse slopes and forest positions, were suddenly vulnerable to artillery that ignored terrain masking. Schwarz's units suffered casualty rates from artillery that exceeded anything experienced on the Eastern Front. More significantly, the psychological effect broke unit cohesion. Soldiers who would endure conventional bombardment refused to remain in positions under proximity-fused fire. Some units experienced discipline problems. Others simply ceased to function as effective fighting forces. American intelligence officers interrogating German prisoners in February and March 1945 noted a recurring theme. German soldiers attributed their defeat not to lack of courage or poor tactics, but to fundamental technological and industrial disadvantage. They described American equipment as reliable, abundant, and increasingly sophisticated. The proximity fuse became a symbol of this disadvantage. A captured Luftwaffe engineer explained that if Germany had possessed proximity fuses, the Allied strategic bombing campaign would have become unsustainable. At loss rates of 15 to 20% per mission, the combined bomber offensive would have ground to a halt. But he immediately added that Germany could never have developed such technology with available resources. The proximity fuse required an economy that could allocate billions of marks to a single weapon system and mobilize over 100 factories to produce millions of units. Only America possessed such capacity, he concluded. Germany's war economy was organized around different principles, maximizing output from limited resources through efficiency and skilled labor. America's economy operated at a scale that made German efforts appear inadequate regardless of efficiency. Another prisoner, a Wehrmacht artillery officer, focused on the tactical implications. He described how American artillery doctrine had evolved to maximize proximity fuse effectiveness. Forward observers called down barrage patterns covering entire areas. Time-on-target missions concentrated dozens of guns to strike simultaneously, creating sustained airburst effects that made survival impossible. German counter-battery fire could sometimes suppress American artillery, but the Americans simply had too many guns, too much ammunition, and too much willingness to expend shells on suspected targets. The officer estimated that American artillery expenditure per target exceeded German rates by a factor of 5. American doctrine accepted high ammunition consumption because American industry could sustain it. This abundance of resources, combined with technological advantages like proximity fuses, created a synergistic effect. Superior technology multiplied the impact of numerical superiority. Proximity fuses made every American shell more lethal. Abundant ammunition meant American gunners could fire proximity-fused shells without conservation. The combination was overwhelming. Back in Berlin, Rheinmetall engineers, who had concluded in 1939 that proximity fuses were impossible, now examined American fuses and confronted their miscalculation. The Americans had not discovered new physics or developed revolutionary technologies. They had applied existing knowledge with extraordinary manufacturing sophistication. The vacuum tubes were miniaturized versions of conventional designs. The radio circuitry used standard oscillator and amplifier configurations. The Doppler detection circuit was elegant but not conceptually complex. The battery design was innovative but buildable with available materials. What German engineers had missed was not that these components could not be made to work, but that they could be made to work reliably in mass production. American engineers had solved hundreds of small problems that aggregated into a functioning system: glass composition that survived shock loading, filament designs that remained intact under acceleration, potting materials that cushioned without adding excessive weight, assembly processes that maintained quality across millions of units. Each individual solution was achievable. Solving all of them simultaneously while maintaining production quality required industrial infrastructure that Germany lacked. The realization was devastating. German engineers were not inferior, German science was not deficient, but German industry could not support the massive parallel efforts required to transform scientific knowledge into reliable weapons at scale. Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, received briefings on captured proximity fuses in February 1945. His response, according to surviving accounts, was to demand immediate German production of equivalent systems. Engineers explained that starting production would require 12 to 18 months to establish manufacturing capability. Göring's counter was that the war would be over in 12 to 18 months, making the effort pointless. The exchange captured the essential futility of German responses to American technology in the war's final months. Germany could potentially develop similar weapons, but lacked time and resources to reach production. American advantages were not primarily in invention, but in the capacity to move rapidly from prototype to mass production. By March 1945, German forces were in full retreat across the Western Front. American armies were crossing the Rhine, supported by artillery that fired tens of thousands of proximity-fused shells daily. The Luftwaffe was nearly extinct, destroyed by a combination of overwhelming Allied air superiority and anti-aircraft fire that had become nearly impossible to survive. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells had transformed air defense from a game of probability to near-certain destruction. Luftwaffe pilots reported that American ships fired shells that seemed to explode whenever aircraft approached, regardless of evasive maneuvers. Night attacks, previously difficult to defend against, became suicidal as radar detection, combined with proximity fuses to enable effective fire in total darkness. German bomber formations attempting to strike Rhine bridges found that American anti-aircraft concentrations could create zones of continuous airburst fire that no aircraft could penetrate. Of 42 German bombers attempting to strike the Remagen Bridge in March 1945, 37 were destroyed before reaching their targets. Most were brought down by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. The statistical analysis was stark. Against conventional time-fused ammunition, Luftwaffe aircraft had approximately a 60% probability of surviving a pass through concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Against proximity-fused ammunition, survival probability dropped below 20%. For bombers making multiple passes to line up on targets, the odds of completing an attack mission against proximity-fused defenses approached zero. This mathematical reality ended German aerial operations more effectively than fighter opposition. German aircraft could potentially evade fighters through speed, altitude, or weather. They could not evade shells that detected their presence automatically and detonated at optimal range without requiring precise aim. The last major Luftwaffe operation, Operation Baseplate on January 1, 1945, lost over 300 aircraft in a desperate attempt to destroy Allied aircraft on forward airfields. Many were shot down by American anti-aircraft defenses featuring proximity-fused ammunition. The operation achieved tactical surprise, but failed strategically because the Luftwaffe could not survive the defensive fire, even when attacking unsuspecting targets. German military leadership recognized by February 1945 that the war was lost. The proximity fuse was not the reason Germany lost. The war had been decided by strategic miscalculations, resource disparities, and the consequences of fighting a multi-front war against industrially superior enemies. But the proximity fuse symbolized why. German defeat was inevitable once America entered the war with full industrial commitment. April 7, 1945. A prisoner of war camp near Reims, France. Hauptmann Werner Braun, the Siemens engineer who had first analyzed captured proximity fuses in January, sat in an interrogation room facing an American technical intelligence officer. Between them lay a disassembled proximity fuse, its components spread across a wooden table. The American officer, Captain Robert Henderson, a former Bell Laboratories engineer now serving with the Allied Technical Intelligence Service, watched Braun's reaction carefully. Henderson had conducted dozens of these technical interrogations, but few had produced the visible emotional response he was witnessing. Braun examined the miniature vacuum tubes with an expression that Henderson later described as profound sadness mixed with professional admiration. "We concluded this was impossible," Braun said quietly in accented English. "Our best engineers, our most sophisticated analysis. We determined that vacuum tubes could not survive artillery acceleration. We were wrong." Henderson asked why German engineers had reached that conclusion. Braun explained the calculations methodically. At 20,000 times gravity, the forces on delicate glass and filament structures exceeded the material strength of available components. German vacuum tubes, even the smallest hearing aid types, would shatter or deform beyond function. "How did you solve it?" Braun asked, gesturing at the American tubes. Henderson, whose security clearance permitted discussing technical details with cleared prisoners, explained the innovations. Modified glass composition with additives that increased shock resistance, redesigned internal structures using spot-welded connections instead of traditional solder joints, filaments with shorter spans and thicker cross-sections, wax potting that distributed acceleration forces more evenly. Each solution was technically straightforward, Henderson noted. The challenge was solving all the problems simultaneously while maintaining production quality. That required testing thousands of design iterations, manufacturing millions of tubes, and accepting high initial failure rates while processes improved. Braun listened with the focused attention of an engineer confronting elegant solutions to problems he had declared unsolvable. "The testing alone," he said finally. "The resources required to test thousands of designs, to fire prototype after prototype, analyzing failures until success. We could not have allocated such resources. Even if we had, we lacked time." The conversation shifted to broader questions about industrial organization. Henderson asked whether German industry could have produced proximity fuses if development had begun earlier, perhaps in 1940 instead of 1937. Braun considered the question carefully. He said, "If we had committed resources, equal to what you clearly invested. But that level of commitment would have required reducing other programs. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, all competed for the same manufacturing capacity. Choosing proximity fuses meant accepting less of something else." Henderson pointed out that America had developed proximity fuses while also producing tanks, aircraft, and ships in overwhelming quantities. Braun's response captured the fundamental asymmetry. You had a larger economy to begin with, and you added to it. We started smaller and subtracted as the war consumed resources. By 1943, German industrial capacity was declining under bombing and material shortages. Yours was still growing. The interrogation continued for several hours, covering technical details of fuse construction, German understanding of American manufacturing methods, and Braun's assessment of why Germany had lost the industrial war. Henderson's report, preserved in technical intelligence archives, documented Braun's central conclusion. German defeat was not primarily about individual weapons or even specific technologies. Germany had produced excellent tanks, effective aircraft, and sophisticated equipment throughout the war. German defeat resulted from cumulative disadvantage across every category. America produced more of everything, and increasingly, American equipment incorporated technological advantages that German forces could not counter. The proximity fuse exemplified this pattern. It was not a war-winning superweapon. It was a very effective weapon produced in overwhelming numbers. That combination, replicated across thousands of equipment categories, created aggregate superiority that German efficiency could not overcome. Other German engineers and officers, interrogated by Allied technical intelligence teams in spring 1945, reached similar conclusions through different experiences. Oberst Heinrich Schwarz, who had commanded infantry-facing, proximity-fused artillery, emphasized the psychological dimension. "We had endured Soviet artillery that fired more shells," Schwarz explained. 1,000-gun barrages that lasted hours. But Soviet shells were conventional. We understood their effects. We knew how to minimize casualties. Your proximity fuses changed fundamental assumptions. Foxholes became death traps. Forest positions offered no concealment. Every position was equally vulnerable. The psychological impact exceeded the physical casualties, Schwarz continued. Soldiers could endure danger they understood and believed they could survive through skill or chance. Proximity-fused artillery created a sense of helplessness. No skill protected against shells that detected targets automatically. No defensive preparation reduced vulnerability. Survival became purely random, dependent on not being in the wrong place when shells detonated. This helplessness broke morale more effectively than physical destruction. Units that had fought tenaciously on the Eastern Front against overwhelming odds simply stopped resisting when subjected to sustained proximity-fused fire. Some soldiers deserted, others surrendered at first opportunity. The remainder fought with visible reluctance, seeking any excuse to withdraw from positions under American artillery coverage. A Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Weber, provided perspective on the aerial dimension. Weber had survived over 100 combat missions before being shot down by American fighters in March 1945. He described the evolution of American anti-aircraft defenses from 1943 through 1945. Early in the war, American ships fired vast quantities of anti-aircraft ammunition with limited effectiveness. Luftwaffe pilots learned to attack through the fire, accepting that some aircraft would be hit, but most would survive. By mid-1944, something had changed. American anti-aircraft fire became dramatically more lethal. Shells exploded when we approached, Weber recalled. Not when we flew near them, but when they came near us. The difference is fundamental. We could evade shells we saw fired. We could not evade shells that detected our presence and detonated automatically. Weber estimated that survival probability against American anti-aircraft fire dropped from perhaps 50% in early 1943 to below 20% by late 1944. For missions requiring multiple passes, such as bombing runs or torpedo attacks, the odds of survival approached zero. The Luftwaffe adapted by attacking from higher altitudes, sacrificing accuracy for survival. American fighters exploited this, intercepting German bombers before they could reach targets. The combination of effective anti-aircraft fire and fighter superiority made German aerial operations unsustainable by 1945. American technical intelligence officers compiled these interviews into comprehensive reports assessing German understanding of Allied technological advantages. The reports documented a consistent pattern. German personnel recognized that they had been defeated not by any single innovation, but by systematic superiority across multiple domains. Proximity fuses represented one example among many. American radar was more sophisticated and more widely deployed. American fire control systems integrated radar detection with gun directors more effectively. American production supplied unlimited ammunition that enabled tactics German forces could not match. But proximity fuses held particular symbolic significance because they violated German technical assumptions. German engineers had studied proximity fuse concepts extensively and concluded they were impractical. The discovery that Americans had not only built them but manufactured them by the millions forced reassessment of fundamental beliefs about what was technologically feasible and economically sustainable. The interrogation reports reached senior Allied commanders and military planners responsible for post-war occupation and reconstruction. General Dwight Eisenhower, reading summaries of German technical assessments, reportedly remarked that the proximity fuse alone justified the enormous American investment in weapons research and development. Eisenhower understood that proximity fuses had saved American lives by increasing effectiveness of anti-aircraft defenses and artillery fire. He also recognized the strategic impact. German forces facing proximity-fused weapons understood they were technologically outmatched. This understanding eroded will to resist more effectively than propaganda or psychological operations. The production statistics supported Eisenhower's assessment. Between late 1942 and August 1945, American factories manufactured 22 million proximity fuses, at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. Peak production reached 70,000 fuses per day, requiring coordination across over 100 factories and thousands of suppliers. Each fuse cost approximately $18 by 1945, down from over $700 in early 1942. This 97% cost reduction resulted from manufacturing innovations, improved designs, and economies of scale. At $18 per fuse, the weapon was expensive compared to conventional fuses costing less than $5, but the increased effectiveness justified the premium. Artillery officers calculated that a proximity-fused shell was worth 5 to 10 conventional shells in terms of target effect. Since the shell itself cost the same regardless of fuse type, paying extra for a fuse that multiplied effectiveness represented obvious value. American doctrine evolved to use proximity fuses liberally, treating them as standard ammunition rather than specialized munitions, requiring careful conservation. This abundance mentality reflected fundamental differences between American and German approaches to warfare. Germany, operating with constrained resources, developed doctrine emphasizing efficiency and conservation. Every shell, every gallon of fuel, every replacement part had to be used optimally because resupply was uncertain. America, blessed with vast industrial capacity and secure supply lines, developed doctrine emphasizing overwhelming force. If expending extra ammunition ensured mission success and reduced friendly casualties, American commanders did not hesitate. Proximity fuses fit perfectly into this philosophy. They cost more but achieved better results with fewer risks. The contrast appeared starkly in artillery employment. German artillery doctrine emphasized precision fire, carefully observed and adjusted to conserve limited ammunition stocks. American artillery doctrine emphasized mass fire, saturating areas with shells to guarantee target destruction, regardless of precise accuracy. Proximity fuses amplified this difference. American artillery could fire large barrages of proximity-fused shells with confidence that each round would achieve optimal effect. German forces attempting to survive these barrages discovered that their traditional defensive techniques were inadequate. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended with German forces thoroughly defeated, their equipment destroyed or captured, their industrial base in ruins. Among the thousands of tons of captured German military material were documents detailing German proximity fuse research and the analysis of captured American fuses. Allied technical intelligence teams spent months analyzing these documents, reconstructing the history of German efforts, and understanding why German programs had failed to reach production. The conclusion was unambiguous. German scientists and engineers understood the principles. German industry could potentially have manufactured proximity fuses. But German strategic priorities and resource constraints prevented allocating the massive investment required. The documents revealed that German research had actually resumed in limited form in 1944, when some restrictions on long-term projects were relaxed. Rheinmetall Borsig developed several hundred working prototype proximity fuses and conducted successful test firings. The prototypes worked, validating that German engineering could solve the technical problems. But by 1944, Germany lacked industrial capacity to establish mass production. Factories were being bombed, raw materials were scarce, skilled workers had been conscripted. The infrastructure required for manufacturing millions of precision fuses simply did not exist, and creating it would have required years Germany did not have. The Allied analysis highlighted a broader lesson about technological warfare. Superior equipment mattered, but only if available in sufficient quantities at the right time. German jet aircraft were technologically superior to Allied fighters, but entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. German proximity fuse prototypes worked in 1944, but production capacity did not exist. American proximity fuses entered combat in 1943 and were manufactured by the millions before the war ended. This timing advantage resulted from decisions made in 1940 and 1941 to invest heavily in research and to begin production tooling before development was complete. The approach carried risks. If the technology had proven unworkable, the investment would have been wasted. American planners accepted these risks because the potential benefits justified them. A working proximity fuse could save thousands of lives and shorten the war. Investing $1 billion was worthwhile if the weapon delivered even a fraction of the projected effectiveness. The calculated gamble paid off spectacularly. German planning emphasized different risk calculations. With limited resources, German planners avoided programs with uncertain outcomes. Investments were made in technologies that showed clear paths to production. This conservative approach minimized waste, but also prevented Germany from developing breakthrough weapons that might have altered strategic calculations. The post-war assessment concluded that neither approach was inherently superior. German methods worked well for incremental improvements to existing technologies. American methods enabled revolutionary advances but required vast resources and acceptance of potential failures. The difference lay in available resources. America could afford ambitious gambles. Germany could not. This resource asymmetry extended beyond industrial capacity to include scientific and engineering talent. America drew on researchers from across the country and integrated European refugee scientists fleeing Nazi persecution. The Manhattan Project and proximity fuse programs both benefited from this expanded talent pool. Germany lost access to Jewish scientists and engineers expelled under racial laws. This brain drain weakened German research across multiple fields. The scientists who remained were talented but faced increasing resource constraints as the war continued. By 1944, German research programs struggled not from lack of ideas but from lack of materials, facilities, and time to pursue promising concepts. The human cost of these scientific and industrial disparities was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. German soldiers and airmen facing proximity-fused weapons suffered casualties that might have been avoided if Germany had possessed equivalent technology. Allied sailors and soldiers survived attacks they might not have survived without proximity fuses protecting them. Statistical analysis suggested that proximity fuses in anti-aircraft roles saved thousands of American lives by preventing ship losses and reducing casualties from air attacks. In ground combat, proximity fuses increased artillery effectiveness, reducing the duration of campaigns and lowering the casualties required to achieve military objectives. These numbers were estimates, but the qualitative impact was undeniable. American forces equipped with proximity fuses achieved battlefield success with lower casualties than similar operations using conventional weapons. The technology provided a genuine force multiplier, turning numerical superiority into overwhelming dominance. The legacy of proximity fuse development extended far beyond World War II. The techniques developed for miniaturizing electronics and hardening components for extreme acceleration became foundational for post-war advances. Missile guidance systems, space exploration, and modern artillery all benefited from innovations pioneered during the proximity fuse program. Dr. James Van Allen, who had developed ruggedized vacuum tubes for proximity fuses, later applied similar miniaturization techniques to scientific instruments for space exploration. The Explorer 1 satellite, launched in 1958, used instruments that drew directly on proximity fuse technology. The Van Allen radiation belts were discovered using equipment that could only exist because of knowledge gained, making electronics survive artillery forces. The industrial infrastructure created for proximity fuse production found new uses after the war. Factories that manufactured vacuum tubes converted to producing television tubes and consumer electronics. Workers trained in precision assembly became the workforce for the emerging electronics industry. Supply chains established for fuse components supported the growth of consumer electronics markets. The broader impact on American industry was profound. Mass production of complex electronics required quality control methods, testing procedures, and supply chain management systems that barely existed before the war. American industry developed these capabilities while manufacturing proximity fuses, then applied them to post-war commercial production. Japanese and European electronics industries, rebuilding after the war, studied American manufacturing methods and adapted them to their own contexts. The techniques pioneered for proximity fuse production became standard practice worldwide, enabling the electronics revolution of the second half of the 20th century. For German engineers like Werner Braun, captured proximity fuses represented both professional admiration and national defeat. Braun's post-war career reflected this duality. Released from prisoner of war status in 1946, he returned to Germany and eventually rejoined Siemens. His work on electronics manufacturing drew explicitly on American methods he had studied during interrogation. Braun later wrote technical papers discussing proximity, fuse design, and manufacturing challenges. His analysis emphasized that German failure to develop equivalent technology resulted not from inferior engineering, but from resource constraints and strategic priorities. German engineers understood the principles. German industry lacked capacity to implement them at scale. This interpretation became widely accepted among German technical professionals. The proximity fuse was not a mysterious American invention that German science could not comprehend. It was a straightforward application of known principles, executed with extraordinary manufacturing sophistication. German failure to produce proximity fuses reflected broader industrial disadvantages rather than specific technical deficiencies. Other German personnel involved in analyzing captured proximity fuses reached similar conclusions. The American achievement was primarily logistical and organizational. Coordinating over 100 factories to produce millions of precision devices required industrial management capabilities that Germany lacked. American civilian industry, accustomed to mass production of complex products like automobiles and radios, adapted readily to military production. German industry, organized around different principles, emphasizing craftsmanship and customization, struggled with the transition to true mass production. German tanks, aircraft, and weapons were often superior in individual quality, but inferior in production quantity. This pattern held across most equipment categories and became decisive as the war continued. The proximity fuse crystallized this pattern. German prototypes worked well in testing, American production models worked well in combat, and America produced them by the millions. Victory went to the side that could produce working weapons in overwhelming numbers, not to the side that could build superior prototypes. Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer, who had conducted the first German test firing of a captured proximity fuse in January 1945, survived the war and was interrogated by American technical intelligence in May. His report on the test firing had circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters, contributing to German recognition that they faced technological disadvantages they could not overcome. Fischer's interrogation covered technical details of the test and German reactions to the results. He described the moment when the shell detonated in a perfect airburst over the empty test range. The German observers had stood in silence, understanding that they had just witnessed technology that invalidated German defensive doctrine. "We knew immediately," Fischer told his interrogators, "that this changed everything. Not just anti-aircraft fire, but artillery employment, defensive tactics, the entire character of ground combat, and we knew we could not counter it. Even if we understood how it worked, we lacked the capacity to produce equivalent systems." The interrogator asked what Fischer thought about American industrial capacity based on the proximity fuse. Fischer's response was recorded in the intelligence report. "Your capacity exceeds comprehension. We calculated that producing millions of proximity fuses required billions of individual components manufactured to precision specifications. The coordination alone, managing hundreds of suppliers and maintaining quality control, represents organizational achievement as impressive as the technical accomplishment." Fischer continued with an observation that captured German perspective on the broader war. "We fought believing that German efficiency and tactical skill would offset your numerical advantages. The proximity fuse demonstrated that you possessed not just numbers, but technology, equal or superior to ours. Once we understood that, we knew the war was lost. Not because of this weapon specifically, but because of what it revealed about your total capabilities. This realization, repeated in interrogations across hundreds of German personnel, documented the psychological impact of technological disadvantage. German forces had entered the war confident in their equipment and tactical doctrine. By 1945, that confidence had been comprehensively shattered by accumulated encounters with American technology that exceeded German capabilities. The proximity fuse stood alongside other American innovations: advanced radar systems, reliable communications equipment, abundant mechanized transport, and overwhelming aerial firepower. No single technology defeated Germany. The combination of multiple advantages across every domain created aggregate superiority that German forces could not match or counter. Post-war military historians analyzing the proximity fuse's impact generally agreed that while not decisive alone, it contributed significantly to Allied victory. The weapon saved lives by increasing defensive effectiveness. It shortened campaigns by making artillery more lethal. It eroded German morale by demonstrating technological disadvantages that could not be overcome through courage or tactical skill. The financial investment, over $1 billion 1940s dollars, represented less than 1% of total American war expenditure. The return on this investment, measured in lives saved and campaigns shortened, justified the cost many times over. Military planners concluded that proximity fuses ranked among the most cost-effective weapons programs of the entire war. The broader lesson extended beyond World War II to shape Cold War military planning. The proximity fuse demonstrated that technological advantages could be decisive if developed promptly and produced in sufficient quantities. This understanding drove massive investments in military research and development during the decades following the war. American defense strategy emphasized maintaining technological superiority through continuous innovation and rapid fielding of new systems. Soviet responses followed similar patterns, leading to an arms race characterized by continuous technological advancement on both sides. The proximity fuse provided an early template for this dynamic. For the German soldiers who faced proximity-fused fire in the war's final months, the weapon represented something more immediate than abstract lessons about industrial capacity. It represented the moment when they understood their cause was hopeless, not because they lacked courage or commitment, but because they faced an enemy with resources they could never match. That understanding, more than any battlefield defeat, broke the Wehrmacht's will to resist. Soldiers who would fight stubbornly when they believed victory was possible surrendered readily once they recognized defeat was inevitable. The proximity fuse contributed to this recognition by demonstrating in visceral, undeniable terms that American technological and industrial capabilities exceeded anything Germany could counter. The war ended with Germany thoroughly defeated, its cities in ruins, its industry destroyed, and its population facing an uncertain future. Among the thousands of lessons drawn from the conflict, the proximity fuse provided clear evidence that modern warfare required not just tactical skill or strategic vision, but massive industrial capacity, capable of producing sophisticated weapons in overwhelming quantities. Nations planning for future conflicts recognized this reality. Military doctrine evolved to emphasize logistics, production capacity, and technological innovation alongside traditional considerations of tactics and strategy. The proximity fuse, more than most single weapons, demonstrated why industrial wars are won by industrial powers. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.